I need hearing aids. What's next? Who will pay for it? And where do I even go? Now, in this video, I want to go through a few really important things to consider when hearing aids may be your next step. So let's get started with that. Welcome to Earman Dan. If you're new here, my name is Daniel and a very warm welcome. I'm a hearing care professional and the owner of Ear Studio in Castle Hill in Sydney. But more importantly, I spend my days helping people, not just to hear better, but actually to understand better and leave behind the challenges of hearing loss. And in this channel, I break down how hearing really works, how the hearing care landscape looks in Australia, and what you can do to get the best possible outcome. Now, I invite you to follow along in this journey. Let's say you've had a hearing test and you consider hearing devices for the very first time. If you're based in Australia, this video is for you as I'm going through a bunch of steps. I may say up front that there will be more than one video as there's a lot of ground to cover, but let's start with the basics. If you've been diagnosed with hearing loss and you were told that you need hearing aids, I suggest do not rush. Do not rush. There's really nothing urgent in the vast majority of cases, so take the time and consider. Don't take too long, like you don't want to delay that for a few years or something like that. But don't rush it. Firstly, I would say educate yourself about the market with videos, talking to friends and professionals. But at that time, I should say that friends and family, they can only talk about their experience, and what they have experienced may be completely different to what you are experiencing. But in general, have a chat to a couple of people and just get a little bit of an idea of what others have to say about it. Essentially, right now you are at the stage where you are faced with some decisions, and every decision is a really important one. So I want you to know what these things that you need to decide on, what they are and what they mean and what effect they may have. At that stage, again, we need to consider that if you have hearing loss, it affects every waking second of your life. And therefore, I suggest that you give it that level of importance. Do not just walk into a shop, buy a hearing aid and walk out. While that can be done, I would argue that good hearing care needs a lot more consideration and time than that. So, what decisions do you need to make? Let's look at a few major decisions. That would, for example, be which pathway to choose. Basically, who pays for the hearing care and who sets requirements? That's actually a big one. Which professional and which company should I choose? Like, who do you trust with that service need of yours? That's also huge. And then it comes down to which hearing aid should I choose in terms of which manufacturer, which technology level and price and style and all of that device-related things. But let's start with the first one, the funding pathways. This is particularly important in Australia as it varies greatly, in some cases even state by state. In Australia, hearing aids are mostly a private affair, with some exceptions. So most people will have to pay privately for their hearing care unless they qualify for some of the available assistance programs. Let me give you a list of the funding pathways. Firstly, there's private funding, meaning you pay yourself and you may or may not have a health fund that may contribute to the hearing care. And then there are government assistance programs. Now, when it comes to government assistance programs, there are state-based and federal-based programs. Federally available is the Hearing Services Program, HSP. This is a program that is accessible for most people that have a pension card, like an age pension or a disability pension, or sometimes even a carer's pension. Then there is the Department of Veterans Affairs, also a federal program, which is for service members who sustained hearing damage as a result of their military service or deployment. And then there is workers' compensation. So for people whose hearing loss is a result of their jobs. Now, workers' compensation is mostly state-based. It's not a federal program. But on federal level, there's another one that's called the NDIS. You probably heard about it a lot. That is for people who meet the eligibility criteria to have hearing loss recognized as a disability. And let me be upfront, this is rather difficult and it's rather rare. I haven't seen it happen much, but it can, but the hearing loss needs to be of a certain severity. Now, what's important to know is that all of these programs have their advantages and their disadvantages. And I think it is really important to discuss what it means to follow a certain pathway. Let's start with the private pathway. And what I like about private hearing care is that you have all freedom to choose whatever you want, but you also have all the responsibility to pay for the services and devices. If you choose to be treated as a private patient, there are literally no limits. You can choose any provider, you can choose any device and any treatment process. You can completely define what you want, and that is your biggest advantage, that you choose. No one else tells you what to do or what to choose. In this case, you obviously also pay the bills and no one else contributes to that unless you have a private health fund that may have some sort of subsidy, but don't be surprised if the contribution that you get is more like an insult than a really big number. But you have full access to every product and every service. Nothing is off limits and you can get the best of the best if you wish. Generally speaking, I would suggest that you assume that you're a private client unless you qualify for some of the above mentioned programs. However, keep in mind that whenever someone else pays for you, there will likely be some decision making on their behalf. And I think you should be well aware of those aspects or even restrictions. Now, needless to say, I am a big fan of the private hearing care market. That is why I have structured my clinic to be a fully private clinic. We are not working with any of the available assistance programs, which I believe is for good reason. That allows us to really invest into what we think is necessary to deliver the best possible hearing care without what I call third-party interference. But let's get into some of the programs and I'll tell you a little bit about it. Let's start with the HSP, the Hearing Services Program. Now, in Australia, this is by far the biggest program when it comes to hearing care. Let me first give you a little bit of history. Many years ago, in fact, many decades ago, just after World War II, the Australian government established a service for children and veterans and for research into matters of hearing aid acoustics. In the post-war years, that service, which was government-owned, expanded into other groups. That service back at the time was solely accessible for government-funded groups, and the general hearing care market was private and separate. So there were two separate things. There was the private market, and then there's the market for those who were eligible. Back in the day, it was mostly veterans and children, which then later expanded to pensioners. There was a reform in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, where the government opened that public market and invited private clinics to contract to the government to make access to essential hearing care easier, while they opened their own company, so the company that the government owned, to the private market for what they considered back then managed competition between the government and the private market. Today, the Australian government owns the company Hearing Australia, which continues to provide hearing care services to eligible people under the program, but also to people of the private market. Enough of the history, on to the eligibility. To be eligible for the Hearing Services Program, a person must be eligible for a government pension. That may be a full pension or a part pension and could be an age, disability or carer's pension. So this is really important to know. If you want to find out if you're eligible for one of these programs, you can either head to their website or call any hearing clinic that is affiliated with the program. They can help you find out if you meet the eligibility criteria. What is important to know that this program is in its first priority an accessibility program focusing on essentials. Providers have to sign a very extensive contract to be eligible to see patients on the government behalf and submit claims to the government for payment. That program provides access to selected hearing care services, such as hearing assessments, hearing device reviews, and even device maintenance. The program also contributes to the purchase of hearing devices through a subsidy on a voucher scheme. Now, patients can then choose from devices that are fully subsidized, where the government basically pays all of that device, or choose to top up with their own money to purchase a partially subsidized device, like a better device that exceeds the subsidy that the government provides. Devices that patients can choose from need to be on the approved list of devices from the government, which gets updated frequently. Most devices, in all transparency, are on the list, but some devices are inaccessible to patients under the program, mainly due to device age, for example. Let's just mention a few facts when it comes to the hearing care program. Clients can freely choose from providers that are on the list of a contracted service provider. However, they can't receive the subsidy from the government through the voucher scheme if that patient were to choose a private clinic that does not hold a contract to the government. Many clinics in Australia hold this contract. In fact, most clinics, I would think, hold that contract with the government, but not all do. There are some providers that only specialize in the private sector and do not hold a contract, such as my own clinic, for example. We cannot see patients that rely on the government pension, as we do not have that contract with the government any longer. Also, there are some services such as earwax removal, tinnitus assessments, or dizziness assessments that are not covered under the program at all, and there's a limit on how many assessments or reviews are covered. For example, the government pays for one hearing assessment in a 5-year voucher period. Should you require more than that one point assessment in 5 years, you may need to pay privately for that. Additionally, the government sets the fees for the appointments, and the clinic with the contract needs to provide that service within that fee structure. It's not that the clinic decides what is needed for each patient and then bills accordingly and just sends that bill to the government. It's a very standardized process. So basically, the government pays for a certain time with a clinician and a subsidy for the product. As a clinician operating under that program, the clinician cannot decide to just spend 2 hours with the patient instead of 1 and then get paid for 2 hours. The government has very strict limits of what can be claimed and what can't be claimed, and also how much they pay. So the clinics that are part of that program, they need to balance the provision of services with the financial viability of their business, obviously. Our clinic has withdrawn from that program due to personal preferences in care delivery, but most Australian clinics remain part of the program. As of 2026-2027, there will be big changes to the program, and I may update you in due course as they become available. Let's move on to the Department of Veterans Affairs. You think that that may be a very simple one, but there are actually quite some caveats. Most veterans don't have a private health fund. Many of them don't, as the DVA normally covers all of their medical expenses. But that is not entirely true when it comes to hearing care. It depends on many factors. Let's first talk about the eligibility. Both the clinic and the patient need to qualify for DVA. You as a patient must have served in the Australian Defence Force or something like national service, and you must have a white card with hearing loss on it, or you have a gold card. So a white card is basically signals to a provider that hearing loss was a result of your service, if hearing loss is listed, or if you have a gold card which covers all medical conditions, that includes also hearing loss. Now, if you are eligible and you choose to go down that route of DVA-assisted hearing care, this is what you can expect. And a couple of restrictions you should also be aware of, at least from my point of view. When it comes to choice of provider, you cannot freely choose which provider to see. The DVA only accepts claims from hearing care professionals that also have that government contract with the hearing services program as discussed earlier. You can choose freely from that list. And again, while most providers in Australia are registered with the HSP, not everyone is. For example, my clinic has withdrawn from that program, as I mentioned before, and now we focus only on the private hearing care market. As a result, we cannot submit claims to the DVA. So if you choose to see us, we can't submit to the DVA, we can't submit to the HSP. You would be fully privately responsible for paying the invoices. We will always make that very clear. There are advantages and disadvantages, obviously. Now, the process is not quite as simple as to go to a hearing care professional, choose a device, and send the bill to the DVA. There's a bit of a process that the DVA has developed, but to their credit, that program has become significantly better and easier in the last few years. It involves a form called the D9398, the Audiology Prior Financial Authorization Request, which the clinic needs to fill out for you. In this form, they need to outline your needs, they need to justify the device choice, and they need to get approval from the DVA before you can be fitted and treated with those devices. When it comes to access to the devices, while in theory, the DVA does not exclude specific devices, you can't just choose, give me the best of the best without having the right justifications for that. If the DVA deems that you do not need those top range devices, they will not pay and only approve a lower tier device. Talking to friends and acquaintances in the industry that I have, it appears relatively easy to get approval for mid-range, sometimes even advanced tier devices if you meet certain criteria. Accessing the top range devices proves to be much more difficult, but may be possible if you qualify for that request and if the DVA seems to agree with that. And if you're the type of person that just wants only the very best for their hearing health, there may be a bit of an uphill battle to work that out. Everything for the DVA must be justifiable by your needs rather than by your wants. So keep in mind that every decision with the DVA is a case-by-case decision. So they literally look at your file and your justification. Now, one limitation that I think should be addressed is that if the DVA pays for a device, you cannot top up. So let's say the DVA approves a certain amount for hearing devices, but you want a better device, then in that case, you can't combine that amount that the DVA pays with private funds, because the approval clearly states that the client must not be charged for a private component for treatment. So you get what you get approved for. In short, if you're eligible for the DVA, it's a reasonably good program with some limitations as just mentioned. So please discuss that with your hearing care professional when it comes time to choose. Now let's talk about workers' compensation. It's a little bit of a tricky subject to address, as it really varies from state to state or territory to territory. In general, there are two claim pathways. One claim is for hearing rehabilitation costs, which is basically meant to cover all costs associated with your hearing treatment and the devices. And then on the other hand, there's a lump sum claim for financial compensation, out of which you can then pay hearing rehab or other things. At least that is the case in New South Wales. Now, I know that some other states and territories only have the lump sum pathway. So you apply for the lump sum, and out of that, you pay for your hearing care. In New South Wales, the eligibility criteria for each pathway is a little bit different, and one does not exclude the other. So you may be eligible for both pathways or only for the hearing rehabilitation pathway. Now, if you want to claim the financial compensation pathway, you will need a lawyer for that or solicitor specializing in workers' compensation claims. There are plenty, you can just look them up. You need to meet a certain eligibility criteria for that, which is higher than the criteria for hearing rehabilitation alone. For the hearing rehabilitation claim, you don't need a solicitor. You can just go to a hearing care practitioner that is registered with workers' compensation, and they can help with all the required steps. Now, they can assist with the initial lodgement of what we call the notice of injury that you will need to complete, and workers' compensation then arranges what they call an independent medical review, where a workers' compensation approved doctor approves or denies that the hearing loss was caused by your employment. Now, there are some limitations in the workers' compensation pathway that I think you should be aware of. Firstly, the claim obviously needs to be approved. And when it does, the treatment pathway actually requires that the provider is registered with both the Hearing Services Program and the Workers' Compensation System. At least in New South Wales, that's the case. So again, you cannot freely choose a provider. You can freely choose from a list, but the provider has to be registered and has contracts with the Workers' Compensation System, and not all providers are. And then one of the major limitations in my view is that the Workers' Compensation has an approved list of devices that the hearing care professional can choose from. So you as a client are not free to choose whichever device from whichever manufacturer. It must be on that list. And that list gets only updated a couple of times a year to my knowledge. Also, what's a big limitation? There are no tier 1 or tier 2 devices on that list. They are specifically excluded. In practice, we see that most people get tier 3 devices. Not more and not less. That's one thing, one of the limitations I think you need to be aware of when choosing your treatment pathway. The other is what they pay for the ongoing maintenance, the repairs, the fitting journey, and so on. While these things are covered to some degree or the other, it's a different story what a clinic can realistically provide you for that coverage. Essentially, workers' compensation has a schedule of gazetted fees that they will pay for a certain service, and a clinic contracted to the workers' compensation scheme needs to provide that work for that fee. A clinic cannot bill what they want or what they deem to be required. The clinic needs to bill what's on the schedule. That's it. I will leave it at that and recommend discussing the details with the clinic that you see if that pathway is suitable for you or you're considering it. My clinic, again focusing on the high-quality hearing care market, has withdrawn from the participation in that programs a few years ago. Now let's talk briefly NDIS to bring this to a close. But we do that briefly because I do not want to open a can of worms. Big worms. I will keep it brief. Most people do not qualify for the NDIS. To qualify, you must be less than 65 years of age and have a hearing loss of a certain degree. Those thresholds are normally not reached by just age-related normal hearing loss. The first step would be to see a hearing care professional to see if you could potentially qualify. Again, most people do not. But if you are under the age of 65 and have a moderately severe level or even severe level of hearing loss or beyond, you might qualify. Then the NDIS needs to accept the condition as a disability, and a plan needs to be structured in a way that allows you to access funding for hearing services. Now, in my experience of the past, that process is rather a bureaucratic process. It's lengthy and involves many appointments, many reports and phone calls, and take a long time. A time that is not measured in weeks, certainly not, but maybe it's measured in months. While accessing funding for appointments, services, consumables, that has proven to be relatively easy under the NDIS. But getting hearing aids funded under the NDIS is something that I have not seen very often in our industry. Very tedious, very involved journey. It is my personal opinion that in this aspect of the NDIS, and I'm only talking about this hearing care aspect as I'm not qualified to comment on the other sectors, but that sector really needs serious review and reworking in order to provide a timely and efficient access to hearing care for people who really need it. So, in summary, there are several government-funded programs available in Australia to the Australian consumer. Most of them require either citizenship or at least permanent residency, among other criteria. Now, all of those systems, as outlined, come with their pros and their cons, and each patient needs to consider what is right for them. Now, if you're a person that chooses who repairs your car and who performs surgery on you, and you do not like to be told where to go and what to do, you can always choose to go down the route of private care, even though you may be eligible for certain programs. For me, it's important that you know that the programs that are available, that you also know what they mean, and that you can make a decision suitable for your situation. Be aware if you choose to go down the private care pathway because you may find that that's better suited to you. you forfeit the subsidies or the contributions from these other programs. Look, I know this was a long video and I didn't want to cut any corners. In the next video, let's look at the landscape of hearing care providers in Australia. Until then, I wish you all the best and bye-bye.